Thank you very much for coming. We know that this is the last panel for today, and it's a Saturday, and everybody would much rather sit somewhere else, but thank you even more for coming. Our panel today is about migrant entrepreneurship, international business, and development. And very briefly, I'm going to frame how the idea came about and where we would like to go with this. So basically, if you look at the different statistics, and especially the International Organization for Migration, you will notice that approximately 1/7 of humanity is currently on the move for one reason or another. Of course, there are positive reasons for migrations and there are less positive reasons for migration. For example, climate change, natural or man-made disasters, conflict, which is unfortunately very common, demographic trends of an aging industrialized population, unemployment, etc., etc. So if you are thinking about the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals, it is very difficult to attack a single goal or a series of goals without thinking about migration one way or the other. And if we are looking at the literature or just into the news, you open up a newspaper, you will see that if migration is well managed, it can be a tremendous asset. However, if it is not well managed, it can be a challenge for both the sending country and the receiving country. So in order to embed the panel presentations of today, I have been doing an in-depth systematic literature analysis, currently of 230 articles, and I guess I actually read them. And really the purpose was to map it. What are the antecedents, both positive and negative antecedents of migrant entrepreneurship? What are the mediators, what are the mediators, and what can be the outcomes? Just very quickly, I don't want to bore you with the details of search strategy, but basically after the first search, I found 1,240 articles, and because we needed some sort of narrowing down, I decided that I'm just going to look at anthropology, area studies, economics, entrepreneurship, and international business for the purposes of today's presentation, but this literature project is much bigger than that. So after manually reading through all the abstracts, we ended up with 230 articles that I subsequently analyzed in detail. So if you look at the composition of the coding within each field, you will notice that there are two topics that are the hottest. This is where most of research activity is concentrating. These are the success factors. What is it that it takes for migrant entrepreneurs to be successful, and what are the moderating factors, which is really the largest one. It is a very, very long list because success factors are very often context dependent. And then you will also see that basically the positive antecedents are most commonly looked at. The negative ones are there because very often we are talking about necessity entrepreneurship and that people are pushed into migrant entrepreneurship. But because very often states think that migrant entrepreneurship can replace certain structural investments, they are trying to pull them as well as push them into that. So if you look specifically at IB, you will notice that in IB, we don't really talk about the reasons for migration, and that's why you see this overinflated part with the 30.95% in terms of types of migrant entrepreneurs, and this 30.95% is coming mostly out of transnational entrepreneurship. So basically, IB's focus is mostly on transnational entrepreneurship, but what we don't look at, while we are thinking about transnational capability, how this really comes about. And there are two moderating factors that have a combined effect. The first one is the different reasons for initial migration, And the second one is how the country of origin is shaping a person's personal but also professional development. And these shapings basically also shape the access of resources they have in their home countries, but also how they can create access in the host country. So Mudambi from Temple University is going to position his presentation into these emerging gaps that we identified from the literature. The second area that came out of this literature analysis is the direction of migration in studies. So if you look at this table here, you will notice that there are 14 papers on returnee entrepreneurship, and those are in developing countries like China, India, Romania, Egypt, Tunisia, and Nepal. And then there are only 26 papers on South-South migration. It is true that in the multiple category, whereby people are comparing multiple home countries and multiple host countries, there are 67 papers, but these are at a very abstract level. So Dr. Stephen Gelb from the Overseas Development Institute, he is participating currently in a long-term project on South-South migration. He couldn't be here today, but we recorded his presentation, so he will be able to brief you on where he is at with this project. And then we are coming to the third area that we identified from this literature analysis. And out of the 230 papers, you will notice that there are only 15 articles on refugee entrepreneurship. And the drivers, the antecedents, and the moderating factors that came out from this analysis were that the negative reasons for migration very heavily impact on the migration experience, which is more frequently negative than positive. And that then creates all sorts of issues in terms of trauma and other type of integration issues. And also the individual characteristics of people and their past professional experiences have an impact on the extent they are capable or willing to integrate in a host country, both structurally and from a socio-cultural perspective. And then we have the related institutional factors. And these are very, very important. We have different migration policies. Some of them are supportive, others are heavily discouraging. We have the legal status and the affiliated rights. Very often people have to sit in a refugee camp or in an affiliated settlement for 3 years without being allowed to do anything. And there is also the availability and the effectiveness of support. There might be support available, but whether it is effective, that is a completely different story. And of course, if in a country there is already an existing diaspora network, either in the form of an ethnic enclave or religious networks that can be either helpful or detrimental, again, it depends on the contextual factors. Which means that refugees have very distinctive support needs, and very often it is even more distinctive than migrant entrepreneurs who are not refugees, who maybe didn't fully choose to leave the countries and immigrate to a different country. They were maybe pushed, but they were not forcefully displaced. So in this literature body, you very often see that entrepreneurship can either be a strategy to bypass these structural constraints, or very often states are trying to push it on the individuals as a vehicle for integration. And in how far that works or doesn't work, again, depends on the interaction of all these factors. So Mr. Wilhelm Brunner, who very kindly came here from Austria, is going to give us a nice case study about how his organization has handled these issues. They are a for-profit international organization providing professional assistance to refugees. And just very briefly, before I give the floor to Ram, our three discussants and the closing remarks. We have Professor Arifan Assche from Assche, Montreal, Professor Davide Castellani from the University of Reading, And Professor Heinz Tuselmann from MMU, unfortunately he couldn't be here for health reasons, but he provided us with slides, so I am going to very briefly present his comments to you. And Professor Becky-Ruber from the University of Toronto is going to provide us with closing remarks. Ram, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Navi, for presenting this so nicely. I'm going to try and run through this very quickly. There's some early thoughts that I've been having on the idea of migration, and they are fairly nascent, so bear with me. I'm going to give an outline here. I'm going to start off with something that you all know, so I won't spend much time on that. There's a lot of tension right now in the 21st century, you know that, from migration. I'll talk a little bit about the dimensions of migration and unpackaging migration and different aspects, different characteristics. I'll talk again about the main focus of my talk today, which is migrants and local operational ecosystems. I'll try and connect this to a term which is pioneered a long time ago now, almost 15 years ago, by Saxenian, brain circulation. I think a famous 2005 paper. I'll talk about and connect that brain circulation idea to ultimately enrich our idea of migration, and ultimately try to say that ultimately the two-dimensional way we should look at migrants, and a very specific kind of migrant. I'm not talking about all migrants, I'm talking about a very, very specific category of migrant, which I'll make clear at the outset. So, and I'll say that ultimately there are strong implications of this bridging social capital view. The human capital versus bridging social capital, two different aspects of migrants. And I'll say that enriching our views by taking these two different aspects are going to have differential perspectives in terms of the impact of migration, of migrant human capital, on startups versus MNEs, large multinational companies. Okay, I'll use the US as a bit of an example. So let's move along quickly. So we all know there are a lot of tensions right now in the world. The mass global migration is a reality around us in Europe, in North America. This is a recent phenomenon, right? So ultimately we knew that oftentimes we try and look at this from a lens of the 19th century. We knew that the US has a multi-century experience with mass migration. But the mass migration of today is fundamentally different from the mass migration of a century or half and a half ago, in the sense that years ago, when people migrated, first of all, you were a once-in-a-lifetime action. You ultimately migrated from a country, went to another country. You never again went home. You cut off all your ties. When you leave Poland and you came to the US, you never connected with Poland ever again. The regular travel, connectivity, people who actually constantly move between countries, it's a tiny fraction of the total population of the world. And so connectivity was limited to very, very few sailors, a few merchants, all these kind of song and story, but really not very much in terms of reality. Today we look at huge numbers, hundreds of millions of people on the move around the world. You can see ultimately Europe, North America, and the particular countries like the US. North America, of course, is the number one destination for migrants. The US is the number one country in terms of migrant destination even today. So the two fundamental views of migrants, and I'm going to talk about this in terms of their influence. I guess point to the influence of the domestic economy, left to right. They have the populist view, which is ultimately migrants are either terrorists or migrants are a burden on the domestic economy, and this is ultimately the populist view that we often get. On the other hand, we have the academic view, and the kind of things that we analyze a great deal in our conferences is fundamentally migrants look like that. Entrepreneurs, innovators, high-skilled individuals. And of course, we have selection bias that's going on. We know in general there's selection bias at both ends, both ends. But the reality, of course, is there's a lot of migration here in the middle. And I'll say ultimately that this dimensionality of migration is extremely important, because in the populist discourse, and even amongst some educated people who should know better, people talk about migrants as though they're all the same. And clearly they're not. There's a huge variance, and this variance is very critical in terms of interesting policies. We know migrants, we have migrants looking for a better life, versus those fleeing persecution. This is the receiving countries. On the other hand, receiving countries look at migrants and say, well, on the one hand, we have valuable human capital coming in. On the other hand, we have humanitarian goals, mercy, and all these kinds of things in terms of dealing with these migrants. So these are, most of the migrants are going to fall into these categories. Oops, I'm sorry, let me do that. And those categories. So otherwise, the diagonal boxes that are going to be largely populated, we talk of hundreds of millions of migrants. Most of them are going to be in those two boxes. On the other hand, we look at the sending countries. We have migrants looking for a better life, and migrants fleeing persecution. On the one hand, the sending countries say, well, those high-value migrants, suppose they send remittances back, they send money back, this is a good thing. On the other hand, the ones fleeing persecution will ethnically cleanse our country and get rid of all these people we don't want. And so that's sort of the way in which they tend to look at the picture. So this is sort of a more perspective view that you might look at. I am going to talk specifically about that box over there. And so I'm going to look at a particular kind of migrant. I'm not going to look at, say, I want to clarify where I am. Okay. And ultimately that's going to connect to that over there. And that's going to basically say that what the people like Paul Wilder and so on have looked at migrants that come across and said remittances back to their home country. That's the way things are being looked at right now. I'm going to argue this is incomplete. I'm going to argue not only is it incomplete, but actually misses the bigger picture of these high-value migrants. There's much more that's going on. Let's go back to that human capital view. The human capital view is when we take these migrants across this distribution, standard distribution of people in general. Migrants are going to have a similar kind of thing in terms of human capital. The human capital view is migrants vary in terms of their skill, value, training, potential, and we have very high value human capital migrants at the very right end. And of course, we know that most advanced countries compete for these migrants. Right? There are some people in the audience I know who are in this category. My cousin, for example, who's worried about Brexit and decided she wanted to leave, person in origin, they want to leave the UK, went to the Canadian consulate and filled out a form and discovered that her point score was so high that she got a plum PR within 2 weeks, and now she's in Montreal. So this is Canada clearly saying that we're looking for people, and she was a design engineer with Gelb, so somebody that Canada thought was worth having. So similarly, we have high human capital migrants. Again, maybe the countries don't compete so strongly for them, but they have options, they have mobility potential, and we have all the rest of them over here that countries don't necessarily want. Right? So we are going to focus essentially on those. The current U.S. immigration system, for example, an example I'm going to look at, begins essentially quick little 35-second view. High school migrants come in essentially by obtaining an OPT visa. This lasts for a year. During those, you have a selection process. Those who can get a job offer, those who don't. So again, you're selecting again on the right tail. If you go on H-1B visa, this costs about $10,000. It take months. While on the H-1B status, again, the employer can further sponsor you, etc., for a green card, further time, further expense, and so on. This can take a minimum of 5 years for H-1B before you can qualify for a green card, etc. What you can see immediately is this heavily discriminates against startups, heavily discriminates against small firms, and both in terms of the employer and the employee and the migrant. Right? So fundamentally, what you have is that this biases the whole system against startups and in favor of giant big firms. So fundamentally, like firms like Google, Microsoft, etc., are benefited. They disproportionately get people, migrants, as opposed to startups, where in fact the US entrepreneurial system would be better off if many of these people were there. And in fact, it shows, the data, this is recent work that just came out last month, Roach and Sperry, show that in the PNAS, that when they're in the program, they're STEM students, STEM PhD students, for native-born Americans are much less interested in terms of intentionality of founding startups or joining startups. You can see that the intentionality of foreign individuals is they are more keen to join startups. But in fact, what happens is the outcome is that actually native-born are much more likely to go into startups than in fact the migrants. Because of course migrants look at the picture, they say if I join this startup, what are the chances chance that actually I'm going to convert my whole PT into an Airbnb. Microsoft can easily do it. They start, God knows if they can or not. And finally, if I get a job with Microsoft, much better chance I get a 5-year window where I'm actually going to go in and get my green card, etc., etc. And so we get this as well. We see again that the share of U.S. and foreign PhD industrial R&D employees working by startup by field. Again, we see that U.S. PhDs are much more likely to go into startups than foreign born. So what we're doing essentially is we're shooting ourselves in the head here. We are hurting our, it's the U.S. clearly, we are hurting ourselves by basically taking these people who are future Elon Musk's, etc., and basically telling them go work for Microsoft. Right? So this is of course a terrible, whoops, I keep doing it. So I argue that this human capital view, so far so good, is incomplete. The incompletion is, and here's where I think future research should go, I argue that human capital view is incomplete. Until the 19th century, high school migrants essentially, unlike those migrants that I mentioned of the 19th century, 21st century migrants do not cut off ties. Unless Castellani has told us there is brain circulation, they're constantly going back and forth. Therefore, they are a source of bridging social capital. Right? So the evidence is accumulating that this brain circulation view actually implies that they connect their birthplaces with their new homes. So I'm going to give you a quick little example here, because I'm not going to use I purposely picked this example, so it's not China, it's not India, it's Romania. So a Romanian migrant, Petronel Vigioi, and another American migrant from the US, both of them went to Ireland and started a company called Foundation. This company is a cutting-edge company working in the area of digital imaging. Actually, they're very, very important these days. Future autonomous driving is completely dependent on this. Also security. Israelis are very interested in this. Chinese are very interested in this. Foundation Timeline. This is the company again which has 60% penetration of high-end smartphones. So 60% of you have Foundation software in your phone, in your pocket right now. They've shipped for 2.5 billion units, 45. And here's a typical Foundation pay. So this is basically something that a typical Foundation pay involves something like Piotr Steck, who's living in Bolingbroke, Ireland. Not a typical Irish name, I'll argue. Alexei Bodin also in Galway, also again probably not a typical Irish name either. We have somebody in Bucharest and somebody in Brussels. Okay, so ultimately we have a connection here with Ireland and Romania. Okay, now this would never happen, right, without Petronel Vigioi. Petronel Vigioi moving to Ireland is the reason this happens. Again, we have another example where you can see the same thing here, where connections between Bucharest and Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley now is connected to Bucharest to this picture. So here's the story for the nation. We have Petronel Vigioi leaves Bucharest, starts off in Brussels, his hometown, moves to Bucharest for a PhD, ends up tries to apply to come to the US, does not get admitted, gets admitted in Ireland, in Galway. Aaron Steinberg married an Irish woman and then wants to go home, and then leaves Rochester to New York and goes to Galway. They both meet over there, try to start this company. In 2000, they have a Facebook moment. If your company really wants to grow, you need to go to Silicon Valley. So they go Silicon Valley, and here we are today, where they have patent distribution. We have an invisible web of co-invented connectivity. Over 100 patents with inventors based in Silicon Valley. More than 100 patents inventors based in Ireland. More than 100 patents inventors based in Brussels, Romania. Okay. So this is essentially this is bridging social capital, right? So ultimately, what we have here is it's a migration success story. Okay, of course, if you go to China, you can find hundreds of these, right? But in India, you find hundreds of these through immigrants to the U.S. And ultimately, we have two things going on here. One is education, which ultimately we see in the U.S. to a large extent, the PhD programs. And the second thing, of course, we have is kinship, marriage. Right? So ultimately, people who they marry really affects where they end up. So if Aaron Steinberg had not married an Irish woman, Foundation would probably have never happened. Right? So ultimately, we have Aaron Steinberg, his marriage took him to Ireland, and ultimately led to a company forming. So ultimately, let's go back again to the dimensions of migration. What I'm going to argue is that it's not only remittances that those migrants give you, they provide connectivity to global innovation networks. Vigioi leaving Brussels connected this I don't want to be anti-Romanian or anything, but I
travel to Virginia. Travel to Virginia. How many Europeans heard about it before the?
Well, there you go. Okay. So it's not New York City. So okay. So this is of course this is European. Right?
Selection bias.
And I guess all in the U.S. Okay, so the point is, so you get this connectivity of all kinds of places which are connected. We do for China, for example, there are all kinds of towns in China that, where you can go get connected to innovation network because people come from their selection bias and they know that environment. Bujoi knew Brussels, he knew who to hire. He knew exactly the kind of people. So he knew, I can get really smart engineers for much less than it costs me in Ireland. Okay, so therefore, this is the kind of, this is we see in Bangalore a lot. Fundamentally, people, Indians know who to hire in Bangalore. A German guy goes to Bangalore, you know who the hell to hire. Because they're all Indians talk fast. So, my argument is that migrants in value of two dimensions. The human capital, the BGO human capital is valuable, but it's also important to examine the munificence of their countries of birth. So who are they connecting to there? They are bridging social capital, but your bridging social capital is not very valuable if they're not, where you're connecting to is a place where nobody exists. Right? So fundamentally, if I come from a date oasis in the middle of the desert, and I come to another country, then of course I'm valuable only the extent that I was in my head. But there's nobody back in the oasis who's worth anything. So that I am not bringing my bridging social capital is no use to my country that I go to. So because there are two migrants, identical human capital, PhDs in biotechnology, for example, thought experiment only. One from China and one from Somalia, right? So there's a Chinese migrant can connect to this rich population of highly educated people in biotechnology back in his home country, whereas the Somali migrant has nothing of value to connect to. So clearly, they're both equally clever. They both have very high IQs. They both have equal human capital. But the British social capital of the Chinese individual migrant is far higher. Right? So ultimately, what this does is it creates two different dimensions. You have one dimension, how smart is the guy in the first place, or girl, or woman, I should say. Or on the other dimension, how valuable is where they connect to? What connections do they bring? So that's right. Bottom line basically is pressure in many countries to curb migration flows. When this pressure is in proper analysis, as I said, following the newspapers, unfortunately, a lot of educated people should know better. Basically, just stop all migrants together. That doesn't make any sense. Obviously, we cut off all migration. We're cutting off our own noses, right? To smile our face doesn't make any sense. So my two key points of today are the human capital being essential to distinguish between high-skilled and low-skilled migrants. If it's just a purely selfish view of migration, a pure selfish view is that we should encourage high-skilled migrants. But I think additionally, not only should these high-skilled migrants, which is the British social capital view, which is that not only among the high-skilled migrants, we probably want to think about those, we should prioritize those who actually are giving us connectivity, better connectivity to valuable resources. Okay, very selfish view of migration, and neither selfish. Yes? I'm done.
I think Ricardo has a question while I'm fixing the video.
Within this very selfish view of migration, like if you look at research, a lot of very successful entrepreneurs actually second generation migrants. So
question and then we need to move on.
Reflection on the question. Very interesting presentation, and I agree with you that we should be doing, not that we should be only doing more of this research, but we should be talking more to the policymakers and to the general public about our research. And if we were talking about that more in general, we probably would not ended up with so much populism and ignorance about what they're talking about. But that's one thing that I thought, you're talking about high, low skill capital, and so basically people that study that. But then it came to my mind all the food, the restaurant industry. So all the Italian food. So these guys were really, really farmers, peasant, right? But just the capital was, I don't know, in the quality of the food from the country or region, or how much it likes or matches the taste of the country where they're ending up. And that's why we have like a lot of Chinese or Italian restaurants or French restaurants. I mean, some kind of restaurants we have, some others we don't. And it's also helped the countries of origin to develop certain industry.
Well, I mean, I would argue with you that people who come, for example, who set up a restaurant, not like we have lots of Somali, Ethiopians in the US who come and set up a restaurant. And clearly it does create some local value, but I would argue in the more modern knowledge economy, the value created by that, either for the US or for Ethiopia for that matter, is significantly less than
unless they manage to put a lot of value on that food. So basically Italians are exporting now as much wine as French, which was not the case at all 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And no doubt
the Italian wine industry or food industry is basically one of the core industries of the country, of the 8 or 9 still industrial power of the
connectivity. I mean, so long as there's connection, and they connect them to. But I study innovation. So
no, I know. It's but it's just like connected with some other things.
So there's no doubt the Ethiopian restaurant import Ethiopian foods, for example, that probably creates.
And we are moving on.
Hello everybody, and I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to join you through this pre-recorded presentation. Thanks to Naomi for both inviting me onto the panel and also for setting up this pre-recording opportunity. I'm going to be talking about a large and complicated research program which I'm involved with, which is just starting, called Migration for Development and Equality, MIDEC, funded by UKRI and also by Irish Aid, and thanks to the sponsors for their support. We're focusing in this project on South-South migration, and our aim really is to deepen our understanding of the interplay between South-South migration, inequality and development. South-South migration is a very important but under-researched part of overall global migration. For example, 36% of all global migrants are people who have engaged in South-South migration, moving from one developing country to another developing country. And so it's quite a significant share of overall migration, as the numbers on the slide show you. The project, as I mentioned, is very large. It involves around 70 researchers overall, looking at a number of different themes, 9 of them including a few looking at axes of inequality like gender or generational inequalities, looking at migration processes, which is where my work fits in. That would include things like migrants' decisions about where they're going to move, and into migrant intermediaries, and then looking at development interventions, how migrants organize themselves. My work is going to focus on resource flows, by which I mean flows of money or finance, flows of goods, that is trade, and flows of knowledge across a set of specific corridors, looking at flows in both directions. A big focus of the work that I'll be doing is looking at migrant-linked businesses, that is businesses owned, managed or financed by migration in both countries of origin as well as countries of destination. As I mentioned, the project as a whole looks at 6 different corridors at 12 countries, which are listed there on the slide. I will be working on the three which are identified in yellow. That is the Burkina Faso Côte d'Ivoire corridor in West Africa, which is actually the largest in terms of the numbers of people moving from one country to another, largest in the world, that is. Secondly, we'll be looking at migrants from China to Ghana. And Ghana there is in part to represent much larger movement from China to all of sub-Saharan Africa, which is written about and discussed a lot in the media. And then the third corridor is looking at Ethiopia and South Africa, the third corridor that I'll be looking at. So it's a mix, as you can see, of middle income, upper, lower and low income countries, but all of them are in the south. Now, looking at migrant-linked businesses, first I want to just talk a little bit about the relationship between migration and entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurs, as has been acknowledged and understood since Schumpeter, are people who are able to identify opportunities and bring resources to bear on those opportunities, to capitalize on them by being able to connect across different groups and across different sources of information. And elective migration, that is migrants who elect to migrate, reinforces entrepreneurial characteristics. So both elective migrants and entrepreneurs are people who can take existing ideas into new contexts and make them work in those new contexts, people who can build and use networks, social and economic networks, to advance their interests, people who are willing to accept risk and able to manage risk, and people who are able to manage marginality, that is, breaking into new markets. You're often on the margin. As an entrepreneur, you're on the margin of those markets, just like migrants are initially, at least, on the margin of the society that they move to. The corridor focus in the MIDEC project underlines that migrants are transnational. They, in other words, straddle the corridor that they've moved along and have a foot in country of origin and the other foot in the country of destination. And this is underlined also by the fact that we're going to be looking at the two-way flows of resources across the corridors. So migrants, as Brinkhoff put it, I think in a very good formulation, have an in-between advantage. They have access to two sets of opportunities, one in the country of origin, one in the country of destination, two sets of resources and two sets of networks, one on each side of that corridor. Of course, that advantage may be offset by social and political hostility, xenophobia, resentment, and so on. But nonetheless, they have that advantage, the in-between advantage. And they have a part of that advantage, I should say, is the language and cultural familiarity on both sides. Initially, perhaps not so much, but as they stay in the new country continues, they build up greater familiarity with the language and the culture. And this puts migrants, as is increasingly acknowledged, into a position as very good and important transmitters of knowledge, particularly tacit knowledge, between the two sides of the corridor, country of origin and country of destination. So migrants' access to two sets of networks provides them with a very considerable resource for their business entrepreneurship, what we could identify or label as social capital. In fact, part of their capital resources are these networks that they have, because, as is increasingly discussed in the literature, those networks reduce the size of their liability of foreignness or their liability of outsidership, being outside of one set of networks. They nonetheless have access to a second set. And this gives them an advantage over local competition on both sides of the migration corridor. I think it's important to distinguish between entrepreneurial activity in the country of destination, what I call entrepreneurial foreign direct investment, and entrepreneurial activity in the country of origin, or entrepreneurial diaspora direct investment, because these differ on a number of different dimensions as mentioned on the slide. Now, entrepreneurial foreign direct investment, often migrants coming to a new country will have limited money capital, and this encourages them to enter activities where there are low entry barriers. For example, retail activities, restaurants, shops, and so on, or light manufacturing assembly, for example, in the clothing or shoe assembly sectors. In making these, entering these activities, their social capital, their access to networks may partially substitute for limited financial or money resources. What is important is that there's an openness, an ability to enter the market in the country of destination. To do this, they also need to bring, as has been shown in many studies of migrant entrepreneurs, they need to bring with them business skills from their country of origin. That's part of their human capital. But they can also, through their diaspora return investment, help to build those business skills back in their country of origin. So we'll look at what they've brought with them and what they have purchased or accessed in the markets to which they've moved, both the entrepreneurial FDI as well as entrepreneurial DDI or diaspora investment. We'll look also at their entry motives, using the standard set of entry motives that we use in international business, that is market seeking and resource seeking, which I think applies to migrant-linked businesses, but we need to add another set, which is risk management and diversification. So family members moving to a new country to manage the family's risk, and then on the return side, diaspora investors investing in their country of origin to, as part of their saving for retirement or to diversify the family risk back in the country of origin. And then lastly, we'll want to look at the impact in the country of origin of diaspora investment, in particular what I mentioned earlier, the ability of diaspora investors to transmit knowledge, either business skills and business organization management capabilities, technical knowledge perhaps, although I expect that to be less important in the South-South space, and institutional development, I think, which could be very important. Okay, so just a few words on the South-South issue. So in the project, the way I'm approaching this is to, because South-South is rather vague, North is vague, we're looking at South-South as referring to a smaller gap in knowledge and technology levels than between the country of origin and the country of destination than a South-North gap. So the gap between China and Ghana, for example, is smaller, or Ethiopia and South Africa is smaller than the gap would be between Ethiopia and the US, which of course is also a big destination for Ethiopian migrants. And what that means is that entry barriers are often lower relative to the resources that the migrant brings, entry barriers in the South. Often, of course, those barriers are informal, and you have informal entry rather than formal business registration, even formal migration procedures. And this may mean that opportunity entrepreneurship is more possible for a South-South migrant than for a South-North migrant. This also, I think, will mean a lower liability of foreignness and outsidership. In the South-South context, the resources and capabilities that need to be mobilized will be smaller in breaking into another South market, and the gap for knowledge transfer in either direction will be smaller. So we want to try to identify the size of this gap in our research. And we're going to do the research by looking at around 350 to 400 firms across these 6 countries, doing a survey which will allow some comparative measure, as well as a very large number of in-depth interviews with people in business networks, with policymakers and regulators and service providers in both country of origin and country of destination, and then some in-depth interviews of the migrant-linked businesses themselves to supplement the survey data. Unfortunately, we can't do a full comparative survey. So to end then, just a few thoughts about what we might find. Firstly, I think we'll find a lot more opportunity on entrepreneurship in South-South migration space. We will find that risk management is an important part of entrepreneurs' motives for moving and investing into countries of destination, as well as diaspora investment going back. We will try to redefine the resources and the scope of resources that are needed for entry and operations by migrant businesses, looking at business skills as part of human capital, looking at networks as part of social capital. We'll try to understand better the process of internationalization, both investment as well as trade, both importing inputs as well as exporting outputs across the corridor, but also into third markets. We will look at knowledge transfers along the corridor, and particularly going back to countries of knowledge, going back from the countries of destination to the country of origin, and raising therefore the overall level of knowledge and bringing in new ideas about business organization and business models from countries of destination and from the practice of migrant entrepreneurship. And then we'll look at how initial conditions in countries of origin affect the overall process. So I hope to have more opportunities to discuss these results as we collect data in our countries of research, and thank you very much. As I mentioned before, this is a project that's just starting, and we'll be doing field research starting in 2020, and I hope to have more opportunities to share results with people in the IB networks as we produce them in the next year or two. Thank you very much.
I will tell him that you clap. Okay. Well, I can type it in. Really?
Good afternoon. ORS Group is a private, for-profit organization providing social care for refugees in 4 countries in Europe with 1,300 employees. We provide care for approximately 10,000 refugees any given time with about 1,300 employees. A little bit more about our company. It was founded 27 years ago in Switzerland. Our headquarters are still in Zurich, with a daughter company in Switzerland, Germany, Austria, and Italy. What's our core business? We provide social care 24 hours, 7 days a week, every day in the year, for what we would probably call, or what the public probably calls, unwanted migration. We're very inspiring to hear the wanted migration. Here are we in the business of unwanted migration. Let's face it, 80% of our residents will not be granted asylum. It's been considered they are seeking a better life, and that's not around asylum. That's a very unfortunate situation and makes the hard work of social workers that much harder. Social work means being here 24 hours a day, providing information, helping, assisting, accompanying. It also means very typical jobs in the medical and psychological arena, but also kind of very daily support activities such as meals, clothing, and hygiene facilities. How are we different from other organizations? As I said, we are for-profit, and we differentiate ourselves from non-profit organizations and also NGOs that we have no political agenda. We are service-driven. We have a contract by public authorities who pay us for our services. We're also not a security company because we employ social workers, not security guards. The guards they don't day and night in centers. It's a very unique position. There are not many organizations like us because the social sector is predominantly a sector for NGOs, charities, and NGOs. That's also the research is coming from companies like this. So that's just an overview of our services. We're talking about support, like meals and clothes and healthcare, facility management for the centers, social care, counseling activities, information available 24 hours, 7 days a week. But also management. In a center, you need to know about who is allowed to come in, who not, and who is participating in which activities, like workshops, German classes, who's coming for the third time for shoes, and where are the other 2 pairs of shoes he's or she may have gotten tested. Yeah, most of you have heard of migration rights. Sure. But there's one other aspect most people don't know. 2014. In 2014, we had an influx of 60% of asylum seekers in Austria. And those 60% brought the system here in Austria at the brink. Almost collapsed. In 2014, guess what happened in January and February 2015? The numbers went down. Only in May and June 2015, the numbers went up. And no capacities have been built into that supposedly. Not internationally, not nationally. You know, strong provisions of worrying about, oh, please, would you do the South of Austria create more capacity? No, I've already so many. Maybe just take it in, maybe you from North Austria. No, wow, me neither. No. We have a long tradition of helping the Turks and excuses. What was doing? So then, of course, 2015 happened, and we had in the initial reception center for about 2,000 versus 4,000. So a complete lack of strategic management on the capacity building. And also, I may say, and I'm not a politician, I don't want to start this discussion here, a lack of support. It's one of the basic pillars of the European Union. Where is the slogan? Where has it been? And Germany is an exception, although this Chancellor Merkel said, you're welcome. What are the specific challenges here? In such a short time, such a huge influx, where do you find the numbers of social workers, trained social workers? And to overcome all these burdens in building, construct new accommodation centers, you have to find a way, a legal way, to bypass the mayor of the town who says, no, this is not the right zone. The next mayor will say, oh, all right, you can build tents here because the camping restrictions of our country is not that. You need more water pipes, all these excuses. So in Austria, as a matter of fact, a constitutional law had to be passed that said that if a community hosts only 1.5% of its population as foreigners or lower, the government can come in and construct a religious campus. And no permits needed from the local authorities. And that helped quite a bit. The challenge was, of course, was also that our country lost control of its borders. Not only did we have 89 asylum seekers that stayed in Austria, over 1 million went through Austria to Germany. And every Austrian felt endangered because politicians on the right wing would claim, oh, all these criminals coming to Austria, they're going to steal the treasures from the house next month. manage those volunteers, make sure they do the right thing, and everybody does the same thing. Lots of frustration among the volunteers who wanted to join us and help us, and we were not prepared. We didn't have the staff, neither the hotline to handle this. So what are the key issues here? How did we meet those challenges? First, we needed to focus on what's really important here. A German class wasn't that important any longer. Any class from any was given up, and beds were brought in. A fitness center emptied. Beds. Medical checks, of course, meals, hygienic standards. If you have so many more people in your accommodation, you have to be very careful and watch that. Waste management. 100,000 euros spent every month on waste and on the removal of waste. Just to give you an explanation of the case, then also in the community. We hired 800 social workers in 6 months, opened up 30 more centers in Austria across the country. Opened a hotline to manage volunteers, but also redirected them to charities, because we are paid by the government. We are, of course, willing to take donations, but for those organizations that depend on those donations, it's much more vital to get those donations than us who are paid for doing what we do. Oh, very true. I had to do these kind of things, telling the population of a city or a committee what they should do. The black box, what's happening in there, standing in front of 400, 500 people. Sometimes nice to me because they want to support us. Sometimes not very nice. There were life-threatening moments in some of these events because people were so angry, so mad about the uncontrolled things. So thank you. And very important, as an organization, stay away from politics. Between left and right, you cannot do right. You never do enough, or you do way too much. How to avoid chaos? Yes, we had 2 years' time to straighten out our processes. We knew exactly how to procure, how to buy, but also had regulations out there what a lunch packet has to include. And a quality management system that goes through many of these things that we do and help us to copy, to be able to introduce these services to more than 30 more locations. And yes, we need to look at a lot of authorities and people to how could a business be better managed? Yes, of course, it needs capacities. And I say this at this moment because many journalists who criticized the government in 2015, why hadn't you prepared for this? Now criticizing the government for keeping vacant accommodation centers. Claiming this is all a waste of taxpayers' money. Every single week you'll find newspaper articles blaming the government wasting money on empty vacant accommodation centers. Solidarity, I mentioned that before. And yes, it needs a national and international strategy collaboration. Now we come to the part of the challenges for refugees, for employed but also self-employed refugees. As I mentioned before, we primarily deal with unwanted migration. There's a lack of German skills, even for the wanted migration. German-speaking countries are not #1 target country. English is not spoken in businesses, so it's hard, even harder for unskilled, not so trained refugees. Yes, many refugees used to work for a university in Austria. And I'm very proud of universities making statements in support of migrants, even unwanted migrants. I can see how universities, especially in the field of international business, are very open to cultures. But when it comes down to recognizing, to nostrify degrees and diplomas from other countries, very, very hesitant. Why has a doctor who just saved the life of a child in a Syrian hospital 3 months later had the only future of being a taxi driver in Vienna in 5 years when he finally gets his asylum grant? And please, I can't let you squeeze out of that so easily. Universities are not run by administrators. They are run by professors like you. Please try. Please make a difference. I was an minister myself, so I know that you contribute. Although you could claim the opposite. All right. We're now going into showing a video because being involved and seeing how difficult it is for refugees once they are accepted and can work to get a job. We founded a new company helping them get jobs. And we asked one of our social workers to tell the story.
سلام و ویژه برنامه بامداد خوش آمدین.
پس ما امروز مهمان ما کسی است که
مسئول رادیو آرمان است. با افتخاره شاد بزنه.
My name is Tariq Majidi. I am from Afghanistan. I have graduated from Kabul University. I have worked for the first music radio station in the country, which is called Arman FM 98.1. I was presenter and manager at the station, and also I was hosting a morning magazine at Tolo TV, which is called Bamdad Khosh. Due to bad security situation in the country and some personal reasons, I had to leave the country. I had to leave everything behind me. With a broken heart, like many other Afghans, I had to go out of the country, and I had no idea where to go, where am I safe. But in 2012 I ended up at Austria. I was struggling at the beginning. I knew no one here. I had to find a way myself. I had to start everything from a whole zero. I had to stand up on my feet. That was the one part. The other part was the paperwork. I didn't have the permission to work and to travel. I had to wait 3 long years to get the permission for work and travel. 2015 was a turning point in my life in Austria because I got the permission to work here and to travel outside the country. After that, I have started searching jobs in the internet. Fortunately, I found one from ORS as a social worker. I applied for the job and I was accepted as a social worker. I started the job 2015 in Trastkirchen with so many refugees from all around the world with different nationalities, color and understanding. For me, ORS is not only a company, but like a school where I have learned and served. They have designed so many courses. For example, I had a course in a social worker position for several months where I have learned so many new things in my job field. The good thing is that the ORS has started now the ORS integration branch, where they help refugees who are struggling in their life like me to get a better job with the official contracts. They also train them to understand the cultural differences in the working area. ORS integration fair jobs, quick solution.
Yes, thank you very much. I think Maciej said everything that was needed to say. It's a new, I have to wrap up in 3 seconds. It's a company that provides job services, training services for both sides, except the refugees, that covers other interests in employing except the refugees. If you enjoy that, cool. Please come and visit Austria during the Christmas time. We have plenty of snow and winter like that. Thank you so much.
Okay. So, so we've had 3 excellent presentations before. The first 2 really demonstrated how our perspective of migration has been changing and how it interacts with the entrepreneurship ecosystem. The third excellent presentation demonstrated the importance of policy when we're thinking about migration. And what I would like to do as the Deputy Editor of the Journal of International Business Policy is to really encourage you to think very carefully about this link between perspectives that we build on issues like migration and what it means about policy. So what we've seen in the first 2 presentations is that there's been an evolution in how we think about migration. Okay? So the first perspective, which was called the human capital perspective, is that ultimately you want to attract a lot of skilled workers, and then if you get a good mass of skilled workers, then this is really going to bolster the entrepreneurship ecosystem. So this type of view is important because it really pushes for policies that strengthens the attractiveness of a location and the ability of skilled people to come to the country. Then you've got a second view, which is the social capital view. And so this indicates, look, just getting people to come is not enough. These people have a liability of foreignness, a liability of outsidership. And so if you really want to bolster the local entrepreneurship ecosystem, you have to find a way for them to integrate. And so you have to develop policies and resources to make sure that people are able to link better with the local system, and that is going to be kind of the thing that will be transforming the local entrepreneurship ecosystem. And then you've got a third view, which Ranry pointed out. He called that the social capital view, but you can also call it the global network view, and which is that ultimately these migrants are not just integrating into the local system. That might have been the situation in the 19th century. They actually are coming with a network in the other countries as well, and that network provides valuable resources that can be really good for the local ecosystem as well. So this view then kind of indicates that when you're trying to create integration, you're not just focusing on local integration, but also global connectedness. So you see here, by just looking at 3 different perspectives on migration, you get a portfolio of ABC policies, which is attractiveness policies, buzz policies, and connectiveness policies. So I would really encourage you to think much more about this link between how we are thinking about issues related to international business and policy. The Journal of International Business Policy has recently actually published a special issue on migration policy, and so I would strongly encourage you all to read the articles in the special issue to think more about how to steer this policy turn in our thinking about migration and other international business issues. Thank you.
Yeah. So Harry was here as deputy editor of Journal of International Business Policy. I was wondering what I'm here for, and I think Noemi is very nice in inviting me. I think I'm here first and foremost because I'm a migrant to a country where the Prime Minister has actually recently said that EU migrants must stop, well, have been making the EU their home for too long. And in the future, apparently, only talented people will be allowed, like nuclear physicists, first violinists, and prima ballerinas. So I studied a dance lesson. I don't know if you offer a dance lesson as well, because in order to be able to stay here. But, so in order to justify my, the benefits that I can bring to this country, I thought, and I connected some research that links very nicely to what Ramesh said and what Ari also, Ari mentioned the fact that the migrants can strengthen the attractiveness of places, and Ramesh said that, of course, migrants now are more connectors than anything else. And I think, some research that we've recently done has looked at how migrants can connect places and bring multinationals in. And because if you think about this, migrants have, of course, positive views and negative views, but we tend to think that multinationals coming in are a good thing, and this country has been investing a lot and is hoping to attract multinationals. And the point is that, is there any link between the migrants coming in and multinationals coming in? And if you take a neoclassical view, that shouldn't, because if you take a trade, an action rolling perspective, for example, if people move, if capital move, goods will not move. So if people move, there won't be any movement of capital. And so migration and trade and FDI would be alternative to each other. But it's not like that, because first and foremost, migrants are connectors, and they help reduce, for example, liability of foreigners. And that helps multinationals coming in. Migrants create demand, and so reduce information costs, create demands, reduce liability of foreigners, and that helps multinational coming in. And in the research that we've done, looking at multinationals' investment in Italian provinces, by looking at migrants from their own country to the province where the multinational locate, we find that actually there is this relationship, and so more migrants are a factor that makes a province more attractive. And more interestingly is that this effect is stronger for knowledge-intensive activities like R&D, like sales, like business services. And it's strongest for firms that have never invested in the country, or for firms that come from more culturally distant countries like South Asia. So basically, I think the bottom line is that Ram is really right, and migrants create connections, and they allow other benefits to, not only in terms of entrepreneurship, which is clearly the big issue of this panel, but also in terms of trade and in terms of multinational activity. So there's this complementarity between different flows of people, goods, and capital that really needs to be considered.
I'm now just very briefly pretending to be Heinz. Picture of him if you haven't met him yet. So I'm not going to repeat points that Ari and Davide made, because obviously Heinz also made them, that we need to connect more to policy frameworks, and we need, with our research, we need to understand more the complexities of how to make policy and contribute to these frameworks. Also to come up with improvements to these policy frameworks. He's strongly encouraging everybody to look at the different UN programs, like the UNCTAD Investment Policy Framework for Sustainable Development, UNCTAD Entrepreneurship Policy Framework and Implementation Guidance, the IOM, etc., as well as to make contributions to flagship UNCTAD products such as the World Investment Forum and the World Investment Report. And he is really emphasizing to help set agendas, because at the moment it looks like that the two sides are very disconnected, and this is what we heard from Willy's presentation, that sometimes it feels like that governments are setting policy and then they are trying to regulate in a vacuum totally divorced from what is going on the ground. And if we can facilitate a bit more dialogue, then maybe we can come up with better solutions. He also is cautioning us to think about migrant entrepreneurship as a panacea, and we heard it from Ram that there are different categories of migrants. And he's also pointing it out that we need to learn more about them and know what are the constraints around them. Because if we are a bit more critical, again, there are so many mediators and moderators. We need to understand those so that we can direct policymakers to set the right incentive and interventions. And in conclusion, he's proposing to the panel and to interested members in the audience, he said that he would be very interested to run a focused issue in transnational corporations, which is also a very policy-oriented journal. So I think if you are interested, we could have a conversation about writing a proposal. I would be very much up for it. Now I'm stopping being Heinz, and I would like to hand over the word to Becky to make the concluding remarks.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm not sure why I'm here either, but thank you. So I guess I'm going to make a couple of quick points, just sort of listening to what went on early. The first one is I think that we as academics have a tendency to classify and categorize and put things neatly in boxes. And I think what I've heard today is just the heterogeneity of migrant and immigrant entrepreneurs out there. So, if we have, some academics in the room that would self-select that way would be very different from people in the video we saw. And just so, if you're looking at policy implications and looking at people's needs and ways to promote people, I think rather than closure, what we might want now is openness and just exploring, maybe using some new methods, just the diversity of what's out there. And so some people may need treatment for trauma and the ability to trust institutions before we can even start to do training. Some people may be in a PhD in biotech, just really different routes and different needs. And I see this in my own family. I have two sons-in-laws. One is a recent immigrant to Canada, and you wouldn't know it. One was born in Canada a year after his parents showed up, and his parents are very much in an ethnic enclave. And so just the diversity in those two families is huge. And so one thing I thought too is that I think we, want to be wary of having an under-socialized view of the phenomena that, we talk about social capital, but we haven't heard a lot about role identities and social identities and just what that means 40 years hence in a company or in a country. We also some people talked about ethnic enclaves, and that's always thought to be a bad thing. You can't get the skills that recent immigrants know about their home market into the country, that there may be limited growth opportunities, but at startup, it does give you a group of customers, it gives you a group of employees you get, and you can have very lucrative careers as criminal lawyers, just my own daughter's-in-laws, criminal lawyers, owners of daycare centers, real estate agents. There is lots of growth and there can be lots of profitability in ethnic enclaves. So I think we need to understand maybe that, open up that black box rather than just have it as a label and look at the diversity there. And then finally, in sort of where are we going, how, the persistence to the second generation and what are the dynamics of some of these things that we're talking about, and particularly in social media. It was a shock to me to see refugees trucking across the Middle East and Europe 4 years ago with smartphones and apps that tracked where people were going and where they should go, and just sort of that instant the technology allows instant information available, and we know there's some herd effects in that. We know does that make things go towards collective movements as opposed to maybe more individual movements, both before and after they get to a host company or country? And what about the social comparisons, just all the implications we know, the societal implications of social media per se, how does that affect this phenomenon where there's sort of instant comparisons? So that's my remarks.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, and the floor is open for questions. We have 5 minutes left.
Yes, I was wondering, I was thinking at one of the points raised by Brown about the fact that in the US you have a predominance of attraction of skilled immigrants. Now that's what I'm going to talk about, skilled immigrants, by large companies, right? Because of the visa system. Canada is another opposite example, where instead you take the human capital for real, you take it seriously, and then you say, okay, we take people on a point system. It's a little bit like Australia, I think. But then you have the risk of overqualified. I mean, you have taxi drivers who have a PhD in physics, right? So, but generally speaking, I would say the policies that are now that we talk about are mostly about attracting employees, right? And look, you have pros and cons. The U.S. system has the pros that you only attract employees for companies that really want them, right? Differently from the Canadian system. But I was wondering, maybe it could be something to discuss. How do you attract? What are the policies that attract entrepreneurs? I think at the moment it's not something that is really on the agenda. I remember I was talking once with the Ministry of with some representative of the Ministry of Enterprise and Industry of Sweden, and they were thinking about extending for PhD students or master students in Sweden with a foreign background the period that they can stay in the country without having some revenues for their own companies, for example. So I think there is a lot there to understand. If our country really thinks that they need to attract entrepreneurs, that was one of your points, then I think there is quite a large room to implement policies, because not so much is acceptable.
I think you're right. I can make just 2 quick points. One is that, particularly in high knowledge areas, there's a strong connection with the education system and entrepreneurship. Particularly, we look at that very high ground and it's a very high value entrepreneurship comes out of, say, Sloan School and Stanford and so on. There's definitely a star system involved there. And I guess the second point I'd like to make is that there are often spillover effects between countries. And there's recently, I just started, Rod Chaudhry is doing some research like this at Harvard right now, looking at the complementarity between the US H-1B system and the Canadian employment system. And what he's finding increasingly is a lot of high-tech startups in the US, in San Francisco, are hiring people, and because of the H-1B cap, they can't bring them in. And so they're setting up satellite offices in Montreal. So basically, or in Toronto. So large startups in Boston are doing the same thing. Boston and Toronto are not too far away. And so basically, we have all these guys, they qualify in Canada, no problem. We can bring them in Canada immediately. But because the H-1B caps, it's really hard to bring to the U.S. And so we get this unintended consequence of the U.S. system generating high-tech immigration in Canada. And many of these companies are startups, right? So essentially all those, because you have these very high-skilled migrants who don't want to work for a startup because in the U.S. because they're not afraid that OPT visa will run out, they'll kick out, and so on. So they say, okay, I'll work with the startup if you guarantee that I don't have to go home again. They say, fine, we'll hire you and we'll put you in Toronto, and you get a PR immediately, and so you're set. Some of them say, oh, I'll stay here. So there's complementarity. It seems like it's in the EU as well. Like we just heard about Germany and Austria, complementarities in terms of migration. Complementarities all, and Schengen is another example of migration complementarities in the movement.
are not perfect, but there's a growing trend of such policies recognizing the innovative capabilities of entrepreneurs. We are in a global race for talent, and so countries are more and more committed. And one thing is the design of good policies. The other thing is the implementation. But there are more and more successful cases.
Even the Trump administration has a proposal right now to say that basically these very, very high-value universities, STEM PhDs, MIT, Caltech, etc., graduation should automatically come with a green card staple to the degree. It's a PhD at Caltech automatically gets permitted. The Trump administration is not well known to be positive supporter of migration.
I'd like to draw the attention to the African diaspora, and my research group in Nottingham is working on that. And we found some fascinating examples that you not only have the social capital issue, but you have real capital issue when you want to set up an enterprise. And because the African diaspora has difficulties to get up the banking system, and they do not trust the banking system in the first place, so what have they done? They have in Manchester sort of created hubs where they do it by themselves. They trust each other, and they have skilled and unskilled people, and they have an unbelievable amount of money circulating amongst them and setting up businesses, going back into their home countries, sub-Saharan African countries, having microfinance there, and it's an absolutely fascinating system, starting with their own knowledge on various STEM subjects, doctors, and they give each other money because they don't trust the system. And now with the university, I know that was for the university, our university has encouraged through global heritage research in many directions that entrepreneurs are encouraged to set enterprises. So there is possibility, and it goes only because interdisciplinary work between different subjects, putting together and encouraged by the Vice Chancellor to do something for the local communities. But there is possibility and knowledge, and so there is a lot of potential of research and in actual real life implications.
Last one, and then
very nice comment. I'd like to continue on that one. For example, if you look at let's say hospitals or use vice for example, they also have mechanisms for funding, but also for the transport to specific places. So the global migration is partly organized. It's quite interesting. So it's like a business plan from the two things. And the rest how they operate are sometimes quite fascinating, just like a multinational enterprise or something like that. But coming back to the policy making side, I think sometimes the diasporic side is already designing the practice system, the policy making side, especially in the kind of new receiving countries that don't have a heritage of these resources, and they know how to implement this.
First of all, I'd like to thank all the presenters, and particularly to congratulate gentlemen for Austria for their outstanding work. I wish that your organization exists in every country and that they have that remarkable results all around the globe. And as I experienced all that he said through my lifetime, unfortunately, I really would like to congratulate you on everything that you're doing. There is just one practical note that I believe is to a certain extent not understandable. Even though institutions supported it, in case of Portugal or any other country, it's not existing because you have to be an entrepreneur in some country. There are so many requirements that actually limiting it. Hence, if you'd like an entrepreneur to enter any country, you have to provide a financial background. If you are immigrant, like in this case, all that financial background is lost. So that institutional challenges are actually very, very, very tough. And I have experienced that in 6 countries. And that's just something that from my experience. So once again, thanks very much for that one, Austria, for us.
Thank you very much for coming.